our Law and Justice segment tonight, two Michigan doctors and a spouse are being charged in the nation's first federal criminal prosecution involving female genital mutilation. But it seems like the State Department is more concerned with not hurting the feelings of Muslims. They want to make it seem like there's no correlation between Islam and female genital mutilation. But is that true? Check it out.
When we think of female genital mutilation, we usually think of African cultures and non-Christian religions. However, my FGM took place in white Midwest America. FGMC is global in scope. It cuts across race, religion, geography, and socioeconomic class.
Joining me now, host of Up for Debate radio show, Christian speaker Julie Roys. Julie, thanks for coming on the show.
Great to be with you, Liz.
All right, Julie, this State Department video was a little startling to me. I've done some research on female genital mutilation since this story broke, a little more in-depth research, I should say. It seems to me, and we'll get to the statistical analysis in a moment, but it seems to me that you can't ignore the correlation between Islam and female genital mutilation.
Yeah, there happens to be a high correlation, but to hear that State Department video, just like you played, there's a 72-year-old white woman there saying, hey, this isn't necessarily what you think it is. It's not necessarily a Central African problem. It occurs in Christian religions as well as non-Christian religions. It's kind of a worldwide thing. And really, in some ways, she's touting the same sort of line that we would hear from Muslim apologist Reza Aslan. He said the same sort of thing when Bill Maher famously several years ago said FGM is an Islamic problem. And Reza Aslan said, no, it's not an Islamic problem at all. This is just a Central African problem. So we need to dispel that myth.
Right. Because, I mean, and even if you look, and I guess this is anecdotal evidence at this point, but all three of the defendants in this first ever prosecution for female genital mutilation, they belong to a certain sect, a certain Islamic sect that believes that female genital mutilation is a religious procedure, and that's being generous, calling it a procedure, and it's supposed to curb promiscuity among women. That's clearly a religious belief associated with Islam.
Yeah, you're correct there. In fact, the attorney for one of the doctors that's charged in this case said that her client, and actually all the clients in this case, are part of this sect, the Dawoodi Bohra Islamic sect. It's located in India, and all of them are a part of this. In fact, she's saying that her client is being persecuted for her religion. She's crying religious persecution with this whole thing. And for people who aren't familiar with this, female genital mutilation, I mean, it's not something that we've heard about much in the United States because, in fact, it hardly ever happens in the United States until more recently. Right now, they're saying, though, that it may be as many as 500,000. So 500,000 girls that have been subjected to this or are at risk of being subjected to this here in the United States. And for those of you who aren't familiar with it, this is the removal of part or all of the female genitalia, usually done to very young girls, or at least before they turn about 13, and done usually against their will. They don't know what's going on. In this case that happened just recently in Livonia, Michigan, these two 7-year-old girls taken from Minnesota think they're going on a girls' outing, and they're going to get, I think that one of the mothers said they're going to get the germs out. And then she's subjected to this. She has no idea what's happening to her. She's being mutilated and marred for the rest of her life.
It's absolutely heartbreaking. I mean, at this point, we've covered this story a number of times. I've read this story a number of times, and you still, even after repeated exposure to it, you don't become numb to it. I mean, these little girls, this happens without their permission. This happens without anesthesia. Can you imagine any other type of procedure happening like this without anesthesia? They're just cut with a razor blade, held down on these tables to curb promiscuity, to curb their sexual capacity. They're also sewn up, by the way, which makes sex very painful, which makes it dangerous, potentially life-threatening for them to give birth. They have to have surgery to undo this as much as you can undo this. I mean, if this isn't a reproductive and sexual health, sexual rights issue, if this isn't a human rights issue, I don't know what is. And I do want to talk about what the critics are saying here, because we need to look at the data, not just the anecdotal evidence, not just the emotional evidence here. Critics say that this not only is not related to Islam, but this is a Central African problem. There are two nations in Africa that are the majority Christian, yet their rate of female genital mutilation is somewhere up to 90% in one nation and 75% in Ethiopia. but that's misleading. If you look at the actual numbers here, it is true that Ethiopia is a majority Christian nation, but they're a majority Christian by just a very small margin, a very, very small margin. And I want to ask Julie about that.
Well, Ethiopia is actually a larger majority Christian than it would be in, say, Eritrea is almost 50-50. It's like 50% Christian, 48% Muslim, I think 2% something else. And then Ethiopia, 65% Christian, 35% Muslim, so a little more of a majority there. But the real question is, and you know, when you can always find sort of these cherry-picked examples, but the question is, when you're doing statistical analysis, you have to look at the whole picture. You can't just look at a little piece of it or the one or two. The question is this significant or is this just an outlier? So you really have to do statistical analysis across the whole board, and then you can come up with, okay, is this a significant correlation or is it not a significant correlation?
Right, and there was actually Dr. Oliver Scott Curry. He's a senior researcher in evolutionary anthropology at Oxford. He did this statistical analysis. What did he find, Julie?
Well, he found what I think a lot of us who have researched this and studied it have found as well, and that is when you have countries that have a high prevalence of Islam, there is a significantly higher correlation of that country also having a high percentage of FGM in that country. Interestingly, also, he found that countries that have a high prevalence of Christianity also have almost the same amount negative correlation of FGM occurring in that country. And it's interesting for me because my mother, actually, her parents were missionaries in Sierra Leone, West Africa. And so the first time I heard of FGM, it was from my mother because they did this in Sierra Leone, West Africa. And she remembers girls being taken when they were like 12 years old into the bush. They didn't have anesthesia. They didn't even have sterilized instruments. Ugh. Some of the time, these girls would bleed to death. But the only ones that objected to it, the only ones that had the courage to say they weren't going to do it, which often meant that their daughters would not be eligible to marry in those communities, but they had the courage to do it, it was the women who, and the fathers, the mothers and the fathers, who had actually converted to Christianity. And so that's what I've seen somewhat anecdotally, but again, as this Oxford researcher found, there is a statistical correlation here. It is an Islamic problem, and we shouldn't be trying to shield that for our politically correct narrative.
No, and I think, I mean, you give an example that is an anecdote, but at the same time, that's what the statistical analysis shows, so that, I mean, that falls in line, that makes sense. It I guess, brings me back to the question, and this is a rhetorical question to end the segment, but why is the State Department trying to hide the correlation then? Why don't they expose this? What are they trying to protect? These girls, these little girls need our protection. This religion, the optics of this religion, certainly doesn't need our tax money to be protected. These little girls do. Shame on the State Department for doing that. Julie, thanks for being on the show.